Venezuela, sitting on the largest oil reserves in the world, more than Saudi Arabia, more than the United States, lost 80% of its GDP in just a decade. Not during war, not under foreign invasion, during peace, during self-rule. In 2012, internal memoranda from PDVSA, the state oil company, documented alarming declines in maintenance, rising production costs, and mass attrition among senior engineers. These warnings never reached the public. By 2019, the outcome was visible from space. Flaring fields dimmed, infrastructure rusted into silence, and entire refineries turned into skeletons. The economy wasn't attacked, it was abandoned from within. This was not a collapse in the conventional sense. It was a methodical disintegration, executed through systemic incompetence, chronic extraction, and a governing logic that treated economics as a battlefield. Nicolás Maduro didn't mismanage a government. He oversaw the transformation of a functioning oil state into a decentralized criminal cartel, not through ideology, but through incentives. What followed was no longer policy, it was entropy disguised as leadership. $100 billion vanished, 7.7 million Venezuelans fled. A national currency underwent so many redenominations it ceased to exist. Hunger became a tool of governance. Gold replaced fiscal discipline. And when oil wasn't enough, the state pivoted to cocaine and conflict minerals. We tend to see collapse as an abstract warning. In Venezuela, it took form, it had velocity, it had price tags, and eventually, it had a jail cell. When governments print value without producing it, when trust in currency dies before the system does, what comes next isn't just inflation, it's decay. Collapse isn't sudden, it accrues, and history rarely offers second chances. And sometimes, collapse begins at the moment of winning. Venezuela won the geological lottery, with over 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, more than any other country on Earth. It had the natural wealth to fuel a century of prosperity. But winning the lottery is one thing. Knowing how not to burn the ticket is another. By the early 2000s, oil accounted for 95% of Venezuela's export earnings. The bolívar, strengthened artificially by petrodollars, turned imports into a cheap addiction. Domestic producers, farmers, manufacturers, even textile makers couldn't compete. It was more profitable to buy Brazilian tomatoes than grow them in Merida. More efficient to import Korean cars than build them in Valencia. The national economy began outsourcing its own survival. This is the classic signature of Dutch disease, an affliction where natural resource wealth distorts a country's economic structure, punishing all sectors not tied to extraction, and in Venezuela, the symptoms metastasized quickly. Instead of using oil wealth to build an industrial base or a sovereign investment fund, the government poured revenue into consumer subsidies. Food, housing, gasoline, electricity, nearly everything was underwritten by the state. In the short term, it created the illusion of progress. Millions were lifted temporarily out of poverty. Urban expansion boomed. But beneath the surface, the productive backbone of the country was evaporating. Factories shuttered, farmland went fallow, supply chains thinned to a single artery, oil, and when that artery constricted, there was nothing left to circulate economic life. The model resembled earlier collapses, Iran in the 1970s, where oil wealth masked systemic dysfunction, Nigeria in the 1980s, where petroleum revenue substituted for governance. Both nations saw booming headline figures followed by long, painful contraction. Venezuela followed this same trajectory, only more extreme, more condensed, more total, by building an economy almost entirely on the volatility of global oil prices. Venezuela became hostage to the market it once dominated. When crude was $100 a barrel, the party lasted. When it dropped below $50, the scaffolding collapsed. This wasn't just poor planning, it was institutionalized fragility. The state became addicted to oil not just as a commodity but as a political sedative. As long as the oil flowed, dissent could be bought off, inflation could be masked, and failure could be postponed. But no boom lasts forever. The real tragedy wasn't the crash. It was the design. A nation rich enough to feed continents became too weak to feed itself. Not because it lacked resources, but because it abandoned resilience. When a country trades production for extraction, it doesn't just lose industry, it loses independence. And when the pump that sustains your illusion breaks, the unraveling begins from within. Imagine a bakery that fires its bakers, stops buying flour, sells the ovens, and then wonders why it can't produce bread. That was Venezuela's oil industry under Nicolás Maduro. But the damage began a decade earlier. In 2003, after a nationwide strike, President Hugo Chavez dismissed over 18,000 employees from PDVSA, the national oil company. Once considered one of the most competent state-run firms in Latin America, the majority were engineers, geologists, and technicians. Their replacements weren't hired for skill but for loyalty. Former soldiers, party operatives, and ideological allies filled the vacancies. Technical know-how was replaced by political obedience. Maintenance declined rapidly. Investment in upstream production was sidelined. Instead of drilling new wells or modernizing infrastructure, oil profits were redirected into short-term social spending, housing projects, free clinics, subsidized food. These programs earned applause at home and praise abroad, but underneath, the machine was rusting. By 2013, when Maduro took office, PDVSA was no longer an oil company. It was a financial sponge for state populism. The rigs were aging, pipelines corroded, refineries frequently shut down due to equipment failure or lack of inputs. Entire oil fields once productive were producing at a fraction of their former capacity. Production figures tell the story plainly. In 2013, Venezuela was still pumping around 3 million barrels per day. By 2018, output had collapsed below 1 million. By 2020, it struggled to stay above 800,000. At its lowest point amid U.S. sanctions and internal mismanagement, it hit 337,000 barrels per day, a 90% drop from peak levels. Internal PDVSA documents leaked in 2019 revealed a devastating truth. Venezuela was producing oil at a loss. The cost of extraction and refining, driven up by inefficiencies, theft, and corruption, exceeded the international selling price. The government was burning cash to export oil, and as production collapsed, so did the ability to import. Venezuela had long relied on oil revenue to buy food, medicine, machinery, and raw materials. With that revenue gone, the pressure on the domestic economy became unbearable. This wasn't just a policy failure, it was infrastructural euthanasia. The country didn't run out of oil, it ran out of capacity. A political purge had drained the human capital needed to keep the wells running. By the time recovery was attempted, the expertise had left the country, and so had the trust. When loyalty replaces competence, the cost isn't just inefficiency, it's collapse. And when the oil dries up but the bills don't, desperation reaches for the printer. When oil collapsed in 2014, Venezuela faced a fundamental economic choice: cut spending or inflate the currency. It chose the latter, with terminal consequences. Instead of imposing fiscal discipline, the government ordered the central bank to print money. At first it was subtle. By 2013, inflation was already climbing, 56%. But within 3 years it became exponential. In 2016, the official inflation rate hit 254%. Then the dam broke. By 2018, the IMF estimated inflation at 130,000%. Black market data suggested it had breached 300,000%. Cash lost value faster than it could circulate. Bolívar notes became so worthless they were used for crafts, purses, hats, even wallpaper. It was cheaper to print napkins on currency paper than to buy actual napkins. Street vendors stopped listing prices, restaurant menus became obsolete within hours. Sellers quoted prices verbally, updated daily, sometimes hourly. This wasn't inflation, it was hyperinflation in the classic sense, comparable only to the Weimar Republic in 1923 or Zimbabwe in 2008. But Venezuela had no war, no famine, no foreign invasion, just a collapsing trust engine. By 2015, the central bank stopped publishing most economic indicators. Monetary policy became a black box. No independent data, no inflation reports, no exchange rate transparency. The institution ceased to function as a central bank. It became an extension of political survival. The real damage wasn't the lost value, it was the lost trust. Money works because people believe it stores value. Once that belief breaks, no amount of printing can restore it. Wages became irrelevant. Paychecks were spent within minutes, often converted into rice, soap, tires, anything but cash. A new underground economy emerged: barter, US dollars, and eventually crypto assets like Bitcoin and USDT. But this shift came too late for most. The vast majority of Venezuelans earned in bolívares, but were forced to shop in dollars. Prices in stores were tagged in USD, food, medicine, even rent. The national currency no longer performed any of its core functions. It couldn't measure value, store wealth, or facilitate trade. This wasn't a side effect. It was a policy, intentional or not, that annihilated the core mechanism of modern economies: monetary trust. And the consequences weren't abstract. Hospitals couldn't buy supplies. Supermarkets couldn't restock. Contractors couldn't quote prices. The entire economic architecture unraveled, not from scarcity, but from confusion. Hyperinflation doesn't just destroy savings, it dissolves time. It makes the future unpredictable and the present unbearable. When governments print to escape reality, they don't buy time, they cancel it. And when money fails to buy food, power begins to speak in rations. By 2016, food insecurity was no longer a warning, it was a daily reality. Supermarket shelves across Venezuela stood bare. Meat, rice, flour, cooking oil, gone. Families queued for hours, sometimes days, to buy essentials that never arrived. The currency crisis had now turned biological. In response, the government introduced a solution, the clap box, officially branded as the local committees for supply and production. These were government-distributed food parcels, rice, beans, oil, powdered milk. On paper, a welfare initiative. In practice, a system of conditional survival. Clap boxes weren't distributed by need. They were rationed by allegiance. To receive one, households had to be registered with the ruling party, the PSUV. Participation in local political activities was monitored. Communities that voted for opposition candidates found themselves mysteriously removed from delivery routes. In critical districts, the trucks simply broke down. Scarcity became strategic. Food became handcuffs, a lifeline that could be tightened or loosened depending on political behavior. A mother feeding her children had to think twice before speaking out. A community organizer risked the bread supply for an entire block. Loyalty wasn't earned, it was rationed. Behind this apparatus was another scandal. Investigations later revealed that Alex Saab, a Colombian businessman tied closely to Maduro's inner circle, orchestrated the clap import scheme. Venezuelan state funds were used to purchase substandard, overpriced goods from overseas, particularly Mexico. The food often had low nutritional value. Some of it failed basic health standards. The profits, however, were immense, and largely off the books. The physical toll was quantifiable. The 2016 Incavi survey showed that 75% of the population lost an average of 19 pounds in a single year. But this wasn't fitness. This was malnutrition. In schools, students fainted from hunger. Hospitals reported rising rates of child stunting and wasting. Chronic deficiencies in protein and calcium were widespread. The state's response was denial. Officials blamed shopkeepers for hoarding, accused the CIA of sabotage, and spoke of an economic war orchestrated from abroad. But the real war was internal. It was a war on autonomy. By destroying the market and replacing it with ration dependency, the regime centralized power in its most primal form, food. This marked a shift in control. Economic repression became biological repression. Opposition was no longer silenced by censorship, but by hunger. In Venezuela, politics wasn't about ideology anymore. It was about survival. When states ration calories by loyalty, democracy isn't just dying, it's being digested. And when hunger becomes normal, escape becomes instinct. By 2025, nearly 7.7 million Venezuelans had left the country. Not for jobs, not for adventure, but to survive. It was the largest peacetime displacement in the history of the Western Hemisphere. And it wasn't just numbers, it was the very brain of the nation walking out the door. The people who fled were the ones most essential to recovery. Doctors abandoned collapsing hospitals where supplies had run out. Engineers left oil rigs that no longer had spare parts. Teachers walked away from classrooms where chalk was shared and textbooks were decades old. The institutional memory of a modern state vanished one flight, one footstep, one border at a time. Then, in March 2019, the lights went out. Literally. The Guri Dam, Venezuela's hydroelectric crown jewel, supplying 80% of the nation's electricity, failed. Not for an hour, not for a day, but for almost a week. In cities like Caracas and Maracaibo, elevators froze between floors. ICU monitors went dark. Refrigerators stopped. Phones died. Entire neighborhoods slipped into medieval stillness. Without power, the water system collapsed. Pumps shut down. In 90-degree heat, families were seen collecting water from polluted rivers and sewage channels to flush toilets or wash clothes. In hospitals, incubators failed. Dialysis machines halted mid-cycle. The number of deaths remains unknown, but doctors confirmed what the state would not. People died simply because electricity disappeared. Maduro blamed a cyber attack. He pointed fingers at the United States, claimed a digital assault was launched from a laptop in Houston, and offered no verifiable plan for repair. It wasn't a defense, it was a deflection. What collapsed wasn't just the power grid. It was the final illusion of state functionality. The failure was total, technological, institutional, and human. This was no longer a government in crisis. It was a territory unraveling in real time. Unlike Cuba's special period in the 1990s, Venezuela lacked both discipline and infrastructure. There were no contingency plans, no organized rationing, no ideological coherence, only silence, decay, and exit routes. The blackout wasn't an anomaly, it was a diagnosis. In a country where the currency no longer worked, the oil no longer flowed, and the food was weaponized, electricity was simply the last light to flicker and die. Collapse had become physical, tangible, measurable in seconds of darkness. You can lose wealth and recover. You can lose growth and rebuild. But when you lose people and power, you lose the capacity to come back. When a country's best minds leave and the lights go out, what remains is not a state, it's a shell. And into that shell stepped something darker than mismanagement, something extractive, illicit, and deeply profitable. By 2020, Venezuela's economy was no longer collapsing. It was already dead. What remained was a shell, institutions hollowed out, systems gutted, trust erased. Yet the regime endured. How? By becoming something new. Not a failed state, but a functional criminal enterprise. That year, Maduro quietly permitted the free use of US dollars. After years of denouncing Yankee imperialism, the government embraced dollarization, not as policy, but as surrender. The bolívar was finished. Hyperinflation had erased its purpose. The dollar became a survival mechanism for the elite, and a cruel mirage for everyone else. Luxury bodegones, mini-malls selling imported champagne, Nutella, and flat-screen TVs appeared across Caracas, but only for the 5% who had access to dollars, regime loyalists, military generals, and those with relatives abroad. For the other 95% who earned in worthless bolívars, these stores became monuments to exclusion. This was the birth of the dual economy. In one layer, the illusion of normalcy. Restaurants reopened, casinos resumed business, influencers claimed Venezuela is back. In the other, systemic deprivation, unpaid salaries, empty pharmacies, and power blackouts. A Potemkin recovery, built on foreign cash flows and elite consumption. With oil revenue in freefall, the state pivoted to extractive survival. In the Orinoco mining belt, the Arco Minero was carved open, millions of acres of protected rainforest, handed over to armed syndicates and corrupt military factions. Mercury poisoning spread through rivers. Indigenous communities were displaced. Gold was extracted not to fund development, but to fund loyalty. Simultaneously, the Cartel de los Soles, so named for the sun insignias worn by Venezuelan generals, turned the military into a logistical arm of transnational cocaine trafficking. Planes flew from clandestine airstrips. Ports were bypassed with government clearance. The state didn't fight cartels. It became one. By 2023, the regime's revenue base was no longer institutional. It was illicit. Gold smuggled to Turkey and the UAE. Drugs trafficked through Caribbean routes. Remittances from the diaspora wired into survival networks. Venezuela became a mosaic of criminal economies, stitched together by coercion and silence. And then came the last opportunity. In 2024, under international pressure, Maduro signed the Barbados Agreement, promising fair elections in exchange for sanctions relief. Chevron licenses resumed. Diplomatic doors reopened. GDP even ticked upward. For a moment, recovery looked possible. Then came the betrayal. Facing certain electoral defeat, Maduro reversed course. He rejected the results, blocked opposition candidates, repressed protests. The US reinstated sanctions. Investors fled. The military, unpaid and disillusioned, withdrew its shield. On January 3, 2026, Maduro was arrested, quietly, not by foreign forces storming the palace, but by a system that no longer found him profitable. The incentives had flipped. A rentier state had become rogue. A rogue state had become criminal. And a criminal state had finally imploded. When a state stops governing and starts extracting, collapse isn't a crisis, it's a business model. And when the business fails, no one shows up to save it. Only the bill remains. Maduro fell, but the numbers broke him first. An 80% collapse in GDP. Over 90% of the population plunged into poverty. A currency so devalued it vanished from the economy. Nearly 8 million citizens exiled across continents. The fall wasn't sudden, it was statistical. The ultimate irony, beneath Venezuela lay enough oil to make every citizen a millionaire. But above ground, trust was squandered, institutions hollowed, and reality denied. Oil, when mismanaged, is not prosperity, it's poison, especially when printed money replaces earned value. This was not the result of war, embargoes, or sabotage. It was the compound interest of decisions, short-term fixes, self-serving policies, systemic rot. And once the machinery of value is dismantled, monetary, moral, institutional, no reserve is deep enough to pull a nation back. What Venezuela leaves behind is not just a ruined economy. It's a warning, a case file, a mirror. Because no nation, regardless of resources, is immune to collapse if it breaks the trust that makes money matter. History didn't repeat in Venezuela. It evolved faster, darker, irreversible. The final debt wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in time lost, trust burned, and in lives broken. Collapse doesn't begin with chaos. It begins quietly on a spreadsheet, in a boardroom, with one silent compromise. And it ends, finally, when even the enforcers stop believing.